Recording started.
You're very welcome to stay on the call for as long as you like. The beauty of a conference call is you can dip in and out if you so wish from the comfort of your own home, car, tractor, kitchen table, wherever. But if you want to ask a question, you can email your questions in to brpconf@eblex.org.uk, or if you wish to text a question, you can text it to 07973 701 211. So just bear with me while I mute all of our incoming callers.
All participant lines have been unmuted. Press #6 to mute your line.
Hi Chris, I'm here. I was just listening to all of that.
Okay, can I just ask, can anyone say anything on the other end at the moment, just to check that everyone's muted?
Hi Chris. Hi Chris. Hello, we're definitely not muted.
Hello.
All participant lines have been muted. Press #6 to unmute your line.
There we are. Hopefully now everyone is muted. I've just unmuted everybody, so that's a good start to the conference call. So we've got Lesley Stubbings with us this afternoon. The normal format of our conference calls has been 2 speakers with 10 or 15 minutes for each speaker, followed by questions. Because this is a very specific topic we wanted to cover today, and Leslie's agreed to participate with us, we've gone for quality rather than quantity. So we only have one speaker today, but had a chat with Lesley as to how to play the call, and we're going to go through 2 or 3 topics. We're going to look at nematovirus because that's a very current issue at the moment for us all as sheep producers. We're going to look at the role of fecal egg counting as a guide to what's happening in terms of our worm management challenges and how to manage that, and probably touch a little bit more on SCOPS at the end of the conference call, just so that everyone is aware of SCOPS. And of course, we are very happy to take your questions in relation to the worm management topic. So what we're going to do is just Leslie's produced an expert view predominantly on the nematovirus issue, and we've also emailed round our BRP worm management manual, which if you've received an email from us, you should have seen a link or a copy of the PDF for that. If you haven't had those and want those for the call, I would advise you to ask us for them. You can email us in on brpconf@eblex.org.uk, and we can just do a quick reply to you so you've got them for the conference call. They will be useful as Lesley goes through her topics. So we're at 1:30. I think that's probably a good time to just sort of kick the conference off. So just to remind you, if you've got questions during the course of the call, send them in. I will then relay those questions to Lesley at an appropriate time, or you can text your question to me at 07973 701 211. I think we're there, Lesley. It's time to introduce you. I was thinking how I was going to introduce you, and I was going to I'm sure many people have had the pleasure of seeing you at an evening meeting or an event somewhere around the country. Your career's been steeped in the industry, but my knowledge of you is historically as an ADAS advisor in the good old days of ADAS when it was a free for use service, and more latterly, probably, I wasn't going to say how many years, but for a good number of years as a private consultant. And in terms of today's meeting, also the person who's coordinated SCOPS for a number of years, which is an industry initiative to look at worm management control. And I think all of that experience makes you a really a top quality speaker for us to enjoy this afternoon. So I'll hand over to you, Lesley.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Chris. No, we won't go into the number of years. Good afternoon, everybody, and let's see how we go with this one. If you have got the manual and the expert view to hand, I will refer to those, and I'll refer to specific pages of the manual, because I think if you are looking at the right bit at the right time, hopefully it will help you understand. What I want to try and achieve this afternoon is to try and maybe clear up some of the confusion, some of the issues that I know. I deal with a lot of sheep farms on a one-to-one basis still, so I'm hoping that I've maybe preempted some of the things and the queries that you have. So if we kick off then with nematovirus, I think this is something which obviously every year comes up. Every year we talk about it, and we talk about there being bad years for nematovirus and good years for nematovirus. And I just want to really start by trying to sort of explain why this dreadful thing is so different to the other worms. And if you've got the expert view in front of you, then you will see a life cycle there. And really this holds the key as to why Nematodiris gives us so much of a headache at times. It looks a bit different to any other worm life cycle until you read in the middle bit, which says that actually that cycle takes between 8 and 9 months to complete. So as opposed to the normal, if you like, roundworms, where in the middle of the summer they can be completing their life cycle in 2 to 3 weeks, so we're getting lots of cycling going on. Nematodiris, you're really looking at the problem this year from the eggs that your lambs put down on pasture last year. And that's, one of the main risk factors. And unfortunately, with most of sheep keepers these days, it's a risk factor for nearly all of you, is if you have lambs that carried lambs last spring, because the ewes are pretty well immune to it. They'll cycle a few eggs, but it's really where lambs are putting down lots of eggs. They then sit there for 8 to 9 months at least, up to 12 months, and then they will start to hatch. And then they're hatching, and they're going to be a problem for the next season's lambs. Now, in a year, why are some years different? Why are some years worse than others? Well, the years that are worst for us are where we get periods in the spring, we get a poor spring, we get a cold spring, and then it suddenly warms up. And the reason for that is that the hatching of the Nematodiris is very temperature dependent. And if any of you have been on our website and seen the forecasts, we're using soil and air temperatures to predict when actually we are going to see hatching in any particular year. If we get a sudden change from cold to warm, we get a lot of eggs hatching at once, and that's when we run into trouble. The lambs are suddenly faced with a massive influx of larvae. Those larvae go into the gut, and they cause, obviously, at worst, they will cause death. And the death rate with a high Nematodiris challenge is very high. Conversely, if we have a spring where it gradually warms up, then the Nematodiris actually hatch quite gradually, and the lambs meet a few Nematodiris over an extended period of time. And the good news is that certainly by the time they're 6 weeks of age, lambs, if they've met a few Nematodiris gradually, will be pretty well immune to it. So it's really a combination of quite young lambs, so lambs that have started eating grass, and also this, are they at risk because we've suddenly had a cold period going to warm. Now, on top of that, each of you needs to look at your farm slightly differently as well, because, of course, depending on how high a field is, or whether it's north or south facing, will up the ante on the risk as well. So very often, a south-facing field is much less of a problem because it gets a bit of warm sunshine, it gradually warms up, and we don't get the big hatch. Whereas a north-facing field, even in the south of England, but doesn't get much sunshine, is a bit of a frost pocket, that can be much more of a challenge, even on the same farm. So this is why sorry, that's my phone ringing, that's gone. This is why we say that we've really got to sit back and you have to look at each year. We try to do the forecasts and give you an idea for your particular area when hatching is likely to occur, but also just to sit back and think about it for yourself. Now, the other good news about Nematodiris is that apart from a couple of very isolated cases in my home county of Cumbria, where we did actually about 3 or 4 years ago now pick up some resistance to the white drenches in Nematodiris, they're very isolated. So certainly any testing I've done since, I've never picked up any problem. So where we're looking at a Nematodiris problem alone in young lambs, we are still able to say to people, use a white drench. It's very effective, and obviously for young lambs, it's likely to lead to fewer problems than 1 or 2 of the other options. Now, when we get to this stage in the year, unfortunately for this year, certainly with quite a lot of my clients, what we're seeing is that we've not had a massive Nematodiris challenge, but we're already now starting to see the other roundworms wake up and wave their evil heads. And so on farms where we know we have white drench resistance, we have to really backtrack on that and start thinking about using probably a yellow is what I'm actually actually going to be using on most of those farms this year. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about nematodirus. If you've picked up that expert's view, you'll see that there is a little table on there, and it just gives you an idea of what the peak risk factors are. So looking at it, I've said if you carried lambs on the pasture last spring, that's going to apply to most people, I guess. Are the lambs old enough to be eating grass? I've got in there 6 to 12 weeks. This year, the ewes are looking quite well. We're probably not looking at two very young lambs. In a year like 2013, the spring from hell, really, I think we'll all remember it. If you watch lambs in a poor spring when the ewes aren't doing very well, they are grazing at a very young age. So you just need to watch that too. Mixing age groups. I mentioned coccidiosis there. Someone, I think, emailed in with a question on that, and we'll try and cover something off on that later. But a little bit of nematodirus coupled with a moderate coccidiosis challenge will cause a lot more trouble than the two, either of them on their own. Some cold snap followed by warm weather, and then we've got other, stresses. So obviously, triplets are going to be, and fostered lambs are going to be under a lot more pressure than others. Now, one other thing that does concern us particularly about nematodirus is that there are quite a lot of people out there now who seem to want to use a persistent wormer on their ewes at lambing time. That's another question perhaps for another day. But just to make you aware that if you have done that, it may have an effect on the further down the line levels of other roundworms, but it will have absolutely no effect on the challenge that you have from nematodirus. And I certainly see year on year quite a lot of people getting caught out by that because they think, well, we've used this persistent wormer and therefore I don't really need to worry about anything. And that's when nematodirus can jump up and bite you where it hurts very, very quickly. Chris, do you want to...
Yeah, we've had a few questions in, Lesley, so perhaps if we can pause there. So just to summarise, one or two of the questions are just sort of clarifying those points about the risk this spring. So just to clarify, that the dry spring will have potentially delayed the hatch, did you say?
Yes, it may well have done. I'm at the moment, if you look on the website, we have reached peak hatching now, temperature-wise, in the vast majority of the country. So really, the only areas where we won't have reached that yet will be, quite high up upland areas, the top of Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, those sorts of areas. So most of the country we've reached it on temperature basis. My one slight concern, and just to warn people who are listening in this afternoon, is that it has been so dry, and we're certainly down the south of England. We are forecast to get some rain at the weekend. That may well just up the ante a little bit, so we just need to be a little bit wary of that.
So the worms are there, but then the other point you were making in terms of age of lambs and their susceptibility, it's when they reach that grazing age, whenever that happens to be, 4, 5, 6 weeks.
It is. Anybody who is in the lower half of the country whose lambs are still only 2 weeks of age, I'd be very surprised if they need to be concerned at all about nematodirus this year. And conversely, a lot of my guys that had lambs that were being born at the beginning of March, they're right in the frame, and we just need to be careful and do that risk assessment.
Yeah. So and again, I suppose the advice really is if you look at the risk factors, if those lambs are on fields which have been grazed before, which many of us have, following this sort of mild weather and a wet spell as well, and we think our lambs are grazing, is it pretty much you drench as a matter of course, or would you still do any further sort of fecal egg counting, or would you just do it as a matter of precaution?
Yeah, I think you have to. The fecal egg counts, as far as nematodirus are concerned, are helpful, really. We have started doing, we'll come on to effects for other worms, but really it's the immature larvae with nematodirus that does the damage. So when we're actually doing the fecal egg count, what we're looking at and having a snapshot of is how many adult egg-laying females of each worm there are in there. By the time nematodirus gets It's too late, that's right. So this is why we really do, and it, you know, I wish it was a really easy thing to do, but it's why we really do want people to stand back and do your own risk assessment, because you just have to take a view. Am I ticking these boxes? Am I in the frame? Have I got fields that I feel are a risk? And of course, coming back to the FECs though, where they are useful when you start doing them for the other roundworms is, they are, and they will always report nematodirus separately. They should always report nematodirus separately. What you can also do is you're informing yourself about the level of challenge on that field next year.
Yeah.
And it's important, you know, record that in your health plan or wherever, but don't lose sight of that, because you can actually start to build up a picture of where your likely high risk is going to be next spring.
Talking of challenge, Lesley, we've had a question in about mixed grazing. So, can cattle and horse grazing without sheep break the nematodirus cycle? So if you're not grazing it with sheep at all, but you are grazing it with other animals, cattle and sheep in this case, would that break the nematodirus cycle for a year?
It will certainly help. You know, I mean, there's nematodirus that are going to say, let's say this spring you put cattle and or horses on a field. I think more so with horses, if you put those on for a year, then next spring 2016, that field I would consider to be a low risk. With cattle, it's slightly more complicated, because certainly if there were young cattle and calves, although nematodirus doesn't bother them, there is evidence that suggests that they will cycle them a bit. So in 2016, it won't be a high risk field, but you mustn't assume that it's very low risk if it's had youngish cattle on there. You know, it will really knock the levels down, but it's not quite as clear cut as that.
Question here, I'm not sure where to put it in, but I'm going to bring it in now, regarding persistent wormers, and you touched on those when you were talking just now. So if I've used a persistent wormer on my ewes, will this make a difference? Presumably to nematodirus, no, because it's the lambs that are passing those eggs on. But will it make a difference?
Well, yeah. The point about nematodirus as well is that the persistent wormers have no persistency against nematodirus.
Right.
And it's not exactly underlined, but if you look on the data sheet, nematodirus is missing from the list of worm species for persistence. So, you know, the thing is that whereas using a persistent wormer on your ewes may, and I say may, have an effect on other roundworms, certainly in the short term, it's not going to have any effect on the challenge that your lambs are facing for nematodirus.
Yeah. Lesley, we're getting a number of questions in about general worming issues, so I think we'll cover those off at the end, if that's all right with everyone, so that we're going to go on to fecal egg counting. I think now that's pretty much covered the nematodirus questions. Just one to clarify and just to summarise then, Lesley. So we've gone through the risk factors. We're in the peak hatching period. It's now we need to be observant, look at our grazing lambs, consider the challenge they're under. Product of choice or group of choice, just to remind us again quite clearly, what would you recommend?
Product of choice is a white drench, with a proviso, though, that if you know you have resistance to the white drenches on your farm species, and a lot of people have, then as we now are getting into where we're getting towards the main worm season, then if you have resistance to white drenches, swap to something else, because if you'll use the white drench, you'll kill the nematodirus, but you won't have any effect on anything else. Okay.
So just to remind everybody, if you haven't downloaded if you haven't managed to click on the link to the BRP Worm Manual, you can go on the BRP website, the eblex.org.uk website, click on the Better Returns pages. Under Health and Fertility, you'll see, under the sheep section, you'll see manual number 8, which is the Worm Control Manual. All of our publications are on the internet, free to view. But the one, Lesley, we'll be referring to next, I think, and later on in the conversation, in the conference call, will be the Sheep Manual number 8, targeting worm control. Okay, Lesley, so we move on to, I think we were going to go on to fecal egg counting and some more general sort of assessing issues.
Yes, okay. I mean, the next thing I had on my list was, you know, basically what is a fecal egg count? And those of you who've got the manual in front of you, I'm going to refer to a couple of pages here just to help us. If I can refer to page 13, there's a bit in the box there which is basically, before we talk about what it is, what can we use them for? Because again, I think that a lot of people have got homed in on this fact that, well, we only use a fecal egg count so we can tell whether or not we need to drench our lambs. And actually, it's a little bit more useful than that, and that may not necessarily be the top of everybody's list. So in there are three things, and the first one is to help determine the need to treat, and it is to help determine, so we can talk about that again in a minute. But also to provide information about the level of contamination going on to a pasture. So again, we're using it not just as a snapshot in time, but as we were saying with the nematodirus, we're looking at what's being put down on the pasture for lambs, in the case of nematodirus next year, in the case of the other worms, in a month, 3 to 4 weeks' time. And that can help make the decision as to whether or not, for example, you wean a bit earlier, move them onto something with a bit of a lower challenge rather than leave them on the ewes any longer. And the other really important one is to test for the efficacy of a worming treatment. And this is the way that you do your first toe in the water to see whether or not you might be having a problem with efficacy, and obviously that means resistance starting to build. So before we go on to any more of that, what I want to say in the outset as to what a fecal egg count isn't, because one of the problems with fecal egg counting is that it is a monitoring tool. It's not a diagnostic tool. Now, what do I mean by that? A diagnostic tool is where people go in and they do a fecal egg count and they want to know whether or not all their scouring lambs or their dying lambs are there and it's a problem with worms. That's not what we use fecal egg counts for, and you are unlikely under those circumstances to get the answer that you want. And the problem is when you look at it in those terms, a lot of people will go in and they'll say, well, I've got scouring lambs in the field, therefore I've sampled the scouring lambs because I want to know if that's worms. Unfortunately, by doing that, if they're scouring, it means that all the material is going through their gut very, very quickly, and the worm eggs and the worms that are pumping out the eggs, you're not going to get a very concentrated sample, so you actually can get a very misleading result if you try using it, in inverted commas, cleverly as a diagnostic. So when we talk about how we do fecal egg counting, how we actually take the samples, it's really important to remember, never ever think of it as being a diagnostic. And we see this being done by professionals and so on as well. It is a pure monitoring tool and can't be used to diagnose disease. How can you get, well, before we do that, I've got 2 page numbers. We're on 13. If you can just flick to 4, just have a quick look at that worm's life cycle, which is the one for, as we said, in the middle there, this one now says that this cycle can take from 2 to 12 weeks, being temperature dependent. So in the middle of the summer, we've got them cycling round all of that from eggs all the way through to being re-eaten as infected larvae in a little over 2 weeks, particularly with homuncus. So what are we doing with a fecal egg count? Well, we're looking at that bit on the left-hand side, which is how many eggs are in the dung. And as I said earlier, that means that we're trying to get a handle on how many adult worms there are in that animal at this point in time. That's really what it's doing for us. And on that basis, we're then saying, well, okay, we think we may need to treat, or we're using it for efficacy, or we're using it for this prediction of what the contamination level will be. And it's really important to understand that, because those adult worms were actually eaten, and you can see that little circle on the right hand side where the infected larvae are there. They're sat in little water droplets on the grazing, and when they're actually eaten, they go inside the sheep. They then mature. That's going to take about a couple of weeks, maybe, 2 to 3 weeks for most of the worms, and then they're going to start laying eggs. So what you're really seeing is a snapshot in time of what those sheep were eating 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we always have to bear that in mind when we're looking at how we actually use fecal egg counts. So very important, I think, that we understand what a fecal egg count actually is. How can you get them done? Well, you can get them done by a lot of vets. Well, vet surgeries will actually do them for you now, varying costs. Some vet surgeries, I think, as little as £5. You can get them done by labs. Quite a few of my guys will use the Scottish Colleges labs, and there are other commercial labs that will do them as well. And you can get them increasingly, your merchant, your SQP at the merchant, your suitably qualified person, they're offering a service as well to do fecal egg counts. And on top of that, you can do them yourself. And there are people out there who are using the original microscope technique. And now there's also available a technique which is very similar in terms of preparing the sample, but then we actually take a digital photograph instead of looking down a microscope. So lots of ways that you can get it done, depending on whether you want to do it yourself and how much you actually want to spend.
Lesley, can I just come in there? A couple of questions in terms of, you've covered several of them in terms of where you can get them done. Is there so you've got your vet involved, or you've asked somebody to do a fecal egg count for you. What are the key questions when they come back to you with the results that you should be asking the vet to get the best out of that fecal egg count?
Well, I think, can I turn that round just slightly, Chris?
Yeah.
Because I think what we ought to do really is first and foremost cover how you actually take those samples, because the quality and the store that you can put in what you get back depends very much on that. One of the concerns that we have at the moment is that there's quite a lot of fecal egg counting going on, which is brilliant, and we want people to get into this and do FECs. But the last thing we want is for people to be getting poor quality, unreliable results back. And that starts with how you actually take the samples. Now, if we go back to page 4, what am I talking about here? I've said that this is a monitoring tool. So what we're doing is we're trying to take samples, and normally we would say we would be looking for 10 to 15 individual sheep samples that are then put together, and we would get a mob answer, yeah? So we're trying to take those samples from 10 or 15 animals within, it might be 100, 200 lambs in the field. They will then be called together, and the answer comes back, and that is a guide to the level in the whole mob. Now, within that, there are obviously pitfalls if you don't sample properly. And I said before, you know, whatever you do, don't ever go out and pick and choose which ones you sample. So the first thing is that to get a quality result, you need to make sure that your sampling is absolutely random. When you go in, whether you bring the sheep into the yards and you take samples there, if you do that, then the acid test is, are they warm? You might like to put a glove on for that, but they need to be really fresh. You can bring them in a yard or hold them up in the corner of the field just for 5 minutes, or as I often do, because I'm doing other people's sheep and I don't like chasing them around, I'll just walk in the field as early in the day as I can, and as they stand up and move around, usually you can follow them and get some fresh samples. But it must be absolutely random, no picking and choosing, and the samples must be absolutely fresh. If they're not fresh, of course, if you look at that diagram, what starts to happen, particularly when it's warm, in the warm sunshine, is the eggs start to hatch, and then they're not there for you to see. The other thing as well is that when you're taking these samples, try to make each sample roughly the same size. So, you know, whether you've got a special spoon as we would have in our FEC pack kits, or just a normal plastic spoon or whatever, a teaspoon size, make sure that you take, you know, roughly the same size sample from each of those 10 to 15 piles of muck in the field, so that you're not biasing the result with one animal. And that's really important. And, you know, some of the stories I hear, I did a course recently for EBLEX up in Yorkshire, and I'm doing another one down here in a couple of weeks' time. We spent a lot of time talking about this because these people on the course were all people using FECs, had been using them for some time, but they'd never actually had that explained to them. And, you know, the concern is that certainly some of the results that we're getting may not be as reliable as they should be. So whoever's doing your sampling, give them a fighting chance by getting the sampling right. Just one other point on that. It's perfectly okay if you take a sample, you can keep it in the fridge for a couple of days, probably not in the fridge in the kitchen, but if you've got a fridge for vaccines and so on, then so long as you keep it in the fridge for a couple of days, that's absolutely fine. Just keep it cool. So, Chris, you then asked me what we do with things.
So the question was, we've done a fecal egg count, the vet rings us up, or whoever's done the sample rings us up and tells us gives us a number. What are the kind of questions we need to be asking those guys to get the best value out of that fecal egg count information? Okay,
so, you'll be given a number, and just to give people, what you really want is for whoever gives you it back to give you some interpretation. That's critical, really. And that comes down to whether or not you've given them information on what the animals were, when they were last treated, are they young lambs, are they older lambs, are they ewes, whatever they are, and that will affect how you interpret it. But just to give people a feel for this, generally speaking, if we're seeing an egg count and it's less than 300 or less, then that would normally come back and we would say, well, that's pretty low. There's no need to start dashing in and doing anything about that. When they start to get to between about 300 and 800, that's the point at which you say, well, actually, I need to think about what these lambs are, and I probably do need to be treating them in the next week or so. Over the 800,000, and I think I'd be flexing the drench gun immediately and going in there and doing something about it. Now, at those sorts of levels, when you get into the thousands, you then probably need to be talking to your vet or advisor about trying to do a little bit of speciation to make sure that you haven't got Haemonchus contortus present. But that's a general guide. So less than 300 is low. 300 to 800, you're in the frame to make a decision. Over 800, the decision's out of your hands.
And again, that's where you get value out of whoever's done the service for you if you go to an independent like that, in terms of what they're seeing and the product that you might be using, etc., etc. And it is a dialogue, isn't it, in terms of what you're treating, what you've treated before, what you've used, the problems you've had, and it's important to have that dialogue.
It is. And, the other thing as well is that it also depends a little bit on what the age of the lambs are. So we're as practical as we can be about this. So if one of my guys rings up and, he's maybe one of my creep feeding guys, one on the phone this morning, and in a month's time he's coming in and he's got an EPG of 300 in a group of lambs, and we're just starting to draw out of that group, then what I would be saying to him, even at 300, I'll be saying to him, well, okay, Mike, next time you go in, you're drawing next week, treat the lambs that you don't mark to go next week, leave the ones that you know are going to go untreated, because obviously they don't need doing, they're doing really well, and also we've got withdrawal periods. So, we're practical about it as well, because the last thing he wants is for me to turn around 3 days after he's been drawing and saying, oh, by the way, Mike, you need to go in and drench all those lambs now. You can be really sensible and practical about it as well.
Questions are coming in, Lesley. So when should we start thinking about fecal egg count samples for lambs?
Okay, when they're about 6 weeks old.
Okay.
That's quite straightforward. So, but having said that, if you're a very early lammer, then it's going to be a bit longer, because obviously it's sort of a give and take between time of year and age of lamb. March lambing people, I would say you need to be having a look probably end of April, beginning of May, to see what's happening.
And then through the season, how frequently would you do that?
In an ideal book, it depends a little bit on what's going on, but as a rule of thumb, you're probably looking every 3 weeks or so. But let's say, that you have to temper with what's going on. So if you get a marginal result back, then again, you can do one of two things. Let's say you get an EPG back of 350 and you think, well, I don't really want to go in and do anything, I'm not under any pressure, then I would be saying to my clients, well, okay, that's fine, but let's have another look in 7 to 10 days, and we'll make a final decision then. again, you can apply practicality to it. But if you think about the worm's life cycle, and they're turning around quite quickly, you do need to be doing them quite regularly.
Mm-hmm. Had a couple of questions from people who actually do their own fecal egg counts in terms of any key tips or tricks for doing a good fecal egg count. So you were talking there earlier on, Lesley, about taking 10 to 15 samples from a mob of maybe 100 or 200 lambs.
Whatever size the mob is, Chris, yeah. The stats say that will give you, as long as you do the sampling properly, the stats say that's enough samples.
They have to be random so that you're not picking one group or another, so you're not sort of targeting the shitty ones.
Absolutely.
Necessarily. Keep the stuff fresh, don't let it cook, so try and keep it cool in a fridge, ideally, until you can get it in the post.
Each sample to be the same size, as near as you can get it.
Sorry, just repeat that one.
Each sample, so each of those 10 to 15 samples, if you're using a plastic teaspoon, whatever, make sure that they are the same plastic teaspoon. Otherwise, sometimes if somebody will bring a sample in, it's quite obvious that there's a great big blob of poo from one lamb and a tiny little bit from another. And that's going to make the big blob lamb have a massive effect on the overall result. So it's really important that you give each their fair crack of the whip.
I think beyond that, Lesley, in terms of how to do your own fecal egg counts and to interpret the information on the slide, that's probably venturing into workshop territory, I think. And we have been talking to you about running some workshops around the country this summer. Is that sort of a level of detail that you might go into on those workshops?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Basically on those workshops, what we're doing is covering off some of the background to it and getting people thinking about why they're doing things and what they're doing. And then we are bolting on an optional session for an hour or an hour and a half in the afternoon, actually looking at the practicality of taking samples and what we do with them. What we're not doing is training people necessarily to look down a microscope. Although that might be possible. If that's what a small group wants to do, then we'll get somebody to do that. Yeah. But we certainly prep the samples, and I'll be using my digital system. Okay.
So just for everyone's benefit, if you're interested in one of those workshops, there's a couple of dates I've seen mentioned. I'm not going to say where they are at the moment because I can't remember, and they may already be booked up. But if you call the BRP event office on 01904 771 213, so that's 01904 771 213, and express an interest in going on one of the sheep worm control or worm management workshops. As we build up an interest a knowledge of where people want them, we can start to target those events in the areas where there are people that want to attend them. I've just been told by Gemma there's only one planned at the moment. But if you let us know that you're interested, at least if we know there's an interest out there, we can try and cater for that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that they're small, 12 to 15 people maximum, that it's people who have specifically expressed an interest. So if you like, it's very much at an intermediate, higher level for people who are already very keen and not necessarily doing their own, but, want to get to that level of detail.
Yeah. So, Lesley, we've got some questions coming in now about the effectiveness of wormers, and I suppose fecal egg count is one way that you can assess that, is it?
Yeah, absolutely critical. I mean, I think if for anybody who's not done any fecal egg counting at all before, it's a pretty daunting prospect to think, I really don't want to get to the stage where I'm actually relying on this to do treating my lambs. And I fully understand that. It's a process that takes time to get confident with. But so a really good starting point, though, is to actually build up a picture as to what wormers are working and what aren't. And it's really quite straightforward to do. When you go in to treat your lambs for the first time, and I'm not saying you have to do that on the basis of effect the first time, but when you do, on the day that you treat them, that's when you take fecal egg counts. So when you've got them in the pens to treat them, you take the samples as we've discussed, and you send that away, and that will tell you what the egg count was on the day they were actually treated. And you write down what the product was. You must then make sure, obviously, that you treat them properly, right dose rate and everything else, calibrate the gun. And then what you do is you go back at a set time later, and we'll give you those dates, and they are in the booklet as well. And in a minute I'll find out what page that's on. It's on page 14. We'll actually tell you how to do that. What you do then is you go back and you take another fecal egg count sample, either 7 days later, that would be for a yellow drench, or 14 days later for all of the other drenches, send that away, and that's when we can tell how effective the wormer has been, because if we get a fecal egg count reduction, so if we get a number of eggs which is 90% or less of the figure that we had originally, we can say, well, that was effective. If it's any less than 90%, it indicates that you're starting to get a build-up of resistant worms. Now, some people say, well, oh boy, I'd really rather not know. But you would really rather know, because the difference it makes when we get people doing that, and they suddenly find, as I had one this last year, who we did a test and we found that the white drench he was using was, well, let's put it this way, the worms were having a damn good laugh. We swapped him onto another group, and his lambs performed so well last year. He actually went out and he's bought his own FEC pack now, so that's how convinced he is. But it makes a huge difference if you're using a wormer which is less than 90% effective and you carry on with it. You're just killing fewer and fewer worms, and your growth rates are dropping off all the time.
And we've had some questions about that, so you're sort of entering we're on to the topic of resistance now. So what happens once you've identified that there is a drench group that's not fully effective?
Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll never use that drench group again. Most people will find, unfortunately now, that the white group is not fully effective against anything other than the Matadyrus. And the worry that we have is that if you look at anthelmintic sales around the country, there's still one heck of a lot of white drench sold. So we know there are a lot of people out there who are gaily going on using white drenches and aren't getting out of them and the worm control they should be. So if you like, that's part of the bad news. You will be, most of you, using white drenches only for Matadyrus in the future. If you go in and you get a result like that for one of the other groups, it isn't the end of the world, because actually what happens is that what we would encourage you to do is to keep doing drench tests through the season, because through the season the type of worms that we're trying to control change, and so therefore does the resistance status. So where we get to is you build up a picture of what worms are effective for you at which time of year, and then you know which ones you can use. So it's rare that it's a black and white, I can never use that one again. It's a lot more subtle than that.
And sort of on that same topic then, we've had some questions about sort of how you rotate wormers. Thank you everybody for your questions. They're coming in thick and fast. How frequently should I change the wormer that I use? Each year I worm 80% of ewes once after lambing before turnout, and lambs either 2 or 3 times over the later summer according to FEC results. So that's probably quite typical, Lesley. How often should they change the wormer that they use? Okay.
Certainly we need to be moving away from using one wormer all season and then going on to another further for the following season. And the reason for that, of course, is that, as I've already said, the white drenches are pretty ineffective on a lot of farms. So suddenly you take those out of it. So what we end up doing now is actually chopping and changing a bit within a season. So let me give you an example. We were talking about Matadyrus earlier on, and I said that with the later, where we are at the moment, we've got other roundworms, and therefore on a farm without with white drench resistance, we are probably going to be looking into using a yellow. Now, the reason why I'm going to use a yellow is that the yellows have got long withdrawal periods, and when we get into the mid-season, most of my guys will squeal at me like hell if I say use a yellow drench in your lambs when they're trying to draw and they've got a 20-21 day withdrawal period. So to ring the changes so that we're not putting a lot of pressure on one group at any one time, that's why I'm now dropping a yellow drench in for quite a lot of my farms, knowing full well that they will then probably revert to a clear drench, not a persistent. I would never use a persistent in lambs, but a clear drench later in the season. And really the basis is to just try and drop in the most appropriate wormer for that job at that time, and so we're not putting a huge selection pressure on the worm population. It used to be said that we had to rotate on an annual basis, and we haven't gone to people and said, oh, you mustn't do that, because it's actually making people focus a little bit at least on what products they're using. But the reality of the situation is that over a season, if let's say you take a lamb now that's 6 weeks of age and it's eating worms off the pasture, when you actually use a drench on that, if any of those worms are resistant, they will actually stay inside the animal for several months. They're not on a 3-weekly cycle. They're going to carry on inside that animal for a long time. So as you use the same wormer all season, the number of those builds. And that's really why this advice that a lot of you will have heard, whereby we're saying to you to use a mid-late season drench with one of the 2 new groups, the group 4 or the group 5, the reason for that is to really just bust that cycle so that these nasty little devils that have built up inside the animal over the season, we can clobber them before they move on.
Okay, Lesley, we're going to enter into the quick fire round, I think, because time's moving on. But the questions are coming in, so I'm assuming people are wanting to stay on the call. We're sort of reaching our normal sort of finish point, but we have got questions. There's a group on coccidiosis, so I'm going to come to those in a moment. But just on this issue of types of wormers, going back to a point we mentioned earlier on, quick point of clarification, what's a persistent wormer? Okay,
basically moxidectin. There's only one class of drug which would be persistent, that would be moxidectin, and there's only 2 trade names, and I'm sure I can mention them, that would be Cydectin or Zernex.
And that's a nice link to the next question. Is there an argument for using a group 4 or group 5 wormer strategically once a year? And if so, when? I don't think you covered that just now.
Yeah, no, I did just cover that in that last bit. So what? No, that's fine. No, it bears repeating. So yes, there is, most definitely. 2 times you would use them. The first one was the one I was just talking about a minute ago, and that was that in the mid to late season to use one or other of those 2, and I would tend to sort of use one year and one the next year. Post roundabout weaning of lambs on those lambs, so that, as I say, we clobber out those worms that have been sitting there and have perhaps been exposed to one or other of the other groups but are resistant to them, to try and, if you like, reset the clock for the year. That's the best time to use those, and we should all be doing that. The second time to use those is obviously as a quarantine treatment when new animals are coming in, or you're bringing sheep back from tack or whatever. One or other of those 2 groups would be the wormer of choice.
Just to quickly remind people that a copy of this recording will be on the EBLEX website on the Better Returns pages, so if you wanted to go back to anything that Lesley's referred to, the conference call will be on there from Monday. Lesley, just one from somebody on a similar sort of tack there. Is there an argument to calendar drench lambs and keep growth rates high and limit the number of wormers in a given season as sales of lambs is speeded up? Not sure if that was...
I'm not sure if I understand that, but I assume that somebody's saying that they want a...
I think it's sort of every 3 weeks. So do I just go in and drench every 3 weeks? So I drench to the calendar rather than drench to
the argument for that is very, very weak, because you will end up drenching more than you need to. So whenever we do the research work, and in fact there's quite a lot of work just coming to towards an end now that's being done. Whenever we do this on farms, and we use someone's very determined to get me. Whenever we do that, we find that we use a lot less wormer, more strategically. The problem with doing it on a 3-weekly basis is the chances are you'll miss the boat. So on one or more of those 3 weekly, you'll treat them unnecessarily, but in 10 days' time, you'll have a problem and you've missed it.
I think that was pretty clear. I think what we're recommending here really is that people need to treat as and when they need to treat with the right products, rather than that old school method of I've always done it this way. Lesley,
and to be fair, the old way of doing it boy, it was convenient, wasn't it? You know, you could actually just write it on the calendar. And what we're talking about now does require us to be thinking a lot more. But the results that we're getting through now, and you will see, people will see more and more of this now. Now we're getting the evidence is that, you know, we're getting better performance by using less anthelmintic strategically.
Leslie, I think you mentioned Zermex. We've had a note in from somebody who said, following the mention of Zermex, could you just remind people that it shouldn't be used if you have used Footvax, as I think they must have had some problems. There is a contradiction there, isn't there?
There's contraindication on the two 1% injections, okay? So the drench formulations are perfectly okay. There's no contraindication on those at all. And neither is there a contraindication on the LA versions either. It's only the 1% versions where's the contraindication. So if you wanted to use moxidectin and you've used Footvax, it is that one product that you've got to avoid.
Okay, we've got questions coming in, but I want to cover this topic. We've had, just so that everyone knows, we've had up to 60 people on the call this afternoon, so thank you very much for participating. As expected, and it's completely your choice, people can come and go, so those numbers have dropped off a bit. But I want to cover this issue of Cocci while we've still got people on the call. So I'll come back to those later questions that have come in if we have time. So on the issue of coccidiosis then, Leslie, can you drench for coccidiosis and nematodirus at the same time, but with two different products?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can, but what you must never, ever, ever do is mix those two products together and administer them. So you can certainly give them on the same run down the race, but you need two guns. Okay.
And thinking about fecal egg counting and coccidiosis, how, or can you, and if so, how, do you interpret cocci egg counts in a fecal egg count? Some are pathogenic and some are not.
With more care than I see done a lot of the time. Coccidiosis, the problem with coccidiosis is that there are, I think, 11 different species, of which 2 are actually pathogenic in sheep. So some people will say, oh, you know, you need to get it speciated. Well, actually, I think we need to use our common sense a little bit on this. So most of the time when people are doing fecal egg counts, they will give you a coccidiosis count. And what I ask my labs to do is to give us a count which doesn't give the actual count, but just says whether it's low, medium or high. Because actually people see cocci counts on a return and there might be 4,000 or 5,000 coccidia there. That is low. But compared to worms, it looks horrendous, doesn't it? You know, you think, oh, heavens above. It's only when we get up into the tens of thousands and possibly even over 100,000 that we start to really get concerned about coccidiosis. Except that, as I said earlier on, if there's nematodirus around as well, you need to interpret that carefully. So with a cocci count, what I would say to you is, if it comes back and it's high, what you need to, for the person who's interpreting, for you to say is that high or not? And it comes back and it's high. Then you sit back and you say, well, what do my lambs look like? Do my lambs look well? Do they look tucked up? Do they look grey at all? Are some of them scouring? Are any of them hanging around the water trough or the pond or whatever, drinking more than they should be? You've then got to do your own risk assessment as to whether or not you think that that is actually something you need to deal with.
A comment from somebody who's listening to the call has just sort of mentioned that their merchant's 24-hour fecal egg count service doesn't screen for pathogenic cocci. In that particular merchant, it takes up to a week to get the results. So just to let people know that there can be, I don't know if you've come across that, Leslie.
It does vary. It does vary a lot, and that's something I think, you know, you need to ask when it's being done. I mean, all of mine would come back if I'm sending into a lab with a cocci on it. But, I mean, and again, you know, obviously with the vet pack, you're not seeing that. So that's something that you do still need to send away.
Leslie, this is a quite specific one, so I give you the option to pass on this question. This is somebody who's had a problem with cocci by the look of things. Lambs are born on the 7th of March. All lambs had the and Zermex LA injection. Some of the poor lambs are scouring and is wondering if there's more he should do. He or she is wondering if there's more they should do.
Well, I mean, the first thing is that as far as, I mean, obviously with something like Vacoxan is not prophylactic, so it won't prevent a problem. And it really this is why it's important to do a bit of monitoring and some risk assessment, because you do have to, you know, nail it and treat at the point when the problem is about to occur, and that can be quite difficult. So if the Vocoxan was given and somebody thought it was going to be preventative, that could be the issue. The second point is, and I'm a bit mystified as to why somebody would use XLA on so I would suggest that if they've done that, they might like to go back and talk to their vet or advisor about that. The problem with that, of course, is that, as we've said before, is not having a persistent effect against nematodirus. So it could well be that nematodirus is giving them JIP now too. And I feel sorry for them because they've obviously done quite a lot, but it could still be catching them out.
Mm-hmm. Just another question on that persistency, and I think it relates to that point, so I'm just going to bring it up. A question, why wouldn't you use a persistent wormer on lambs? I think you covered it, but could you just clarify that for us again?
Okay. I certainly wouldn't ever use the LA product, and I think you find that the manufacturers also wouldn't recommend normally. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it just isn't the strategic use of those products. I would be nervous about using the persistent products on lambs because, as I say, they have got limited persistency against some of the main things. So they have persistency against Homunculus contortus and what we used to call osteotargia, but very limited persistency against the black scourworm, for example. So if you're not careful and you don't know what you're doing, you can lull yourself into a false sense of security and think, well, I'm going to be all right now for 8 weeks, and then one of these other worms comes along and you suddenly got a problem. So I wouldn't say never use them, but just be careful that you understand the benefits and the limitations should you do that. Mm-hmm. And if you're using your fecal egg counting, to be honest, the other wormers a lot of the time will give you what you need.
Very quick one about in refugia. So we're sometimes told not to treat all sheep in the same group. Why? And is there another option?
Yeah, there is. The reason why we suggest that where possible we don't treat all of the sheep in a group is that we are just trying to